All right. I'm going to begin my talk to you today with a bit of a confession. I come here from Toronto during a time of backlash. And just this morning, the first piece of news that I got on my phone was news that 2 days ago, the Association of Collegiate Art Schools of Architecture canceled the special issue on Palestine of the Journal of Architectural Education and fired its interim executive director. So this is one of literally daily events for a long time now. So this is the context that I'm speaking within. In my time here in Victoria, I've had the opportunity to speak 3 times. And this is my third and final time speaking. During my first presentation, actually at Menno's class, I spoke of monochrome painting and the experience of colonial erasure in Toronto, the place that I call home. So this is an image of an artwork titled The Ward that touches on this idea of monochrome painting and the experience of colonial erasure. During that first talk, I spoke about what I described as an encounter with obduracy, meeting a dead end, being up against the wall, and of having nothing to grab onto. That, I suggested, is an experience that's deeply ingrained in colonial space. Acts of colonial erasure produce feelings of being up against the wall with nothing to grab onto. During my second presentation, I spoke about the ideological function of art museums as disciplinary institutions for inscribing and reinscribing social hierarchies. And it is to museums as institutions that I come to you to speak about today. I've decided to speak about the Art Gallery of Ontario specifically, and this experience of being up against the wall. I'll speak about 2 particular events, one in 2001 and the other one more recently in 2023. In 2001, I exhibited my work at the AGO in an exhibition titled House Guests, Contemporary Art in the Grange, that was conceived by curators Christina Ritchie and Jessica Bradley. So works by contemporary artists were installed in the Grange, the 19th century house that became the home of Toronto's first art museum. So the museum was originally established in 1900 as the Art Museum of Toronto. It was renamed as the Art Gallery of Toronto in 1919 before adopting its present name, the Art Gallery of Ontario, in 1966. So the exhibition House Guests was presented on the museum's 100th anniversary in 2001. In response to the curator's invitation, I decided to create a light sculpture that featured a figure running through one of the rooms in the Grange house into one of the walls. So this is a kind of diagram visualizing this light sculpture featuring the figure running through the space into one of the walls. The figure was pixelated, so it was created out of these dots of light as a kind of stick figure rendered as these floating points of LED lights. Its running movement was frozen at 6 points of its trajectory through the music room of the house, running towards a wall facing outdoors, towards the Grange Park to the south. So, as a young artist, I was just shy of my 30th birthday. I felt honored to have been invited to create a work at the AGO. Looking back on this a quarter of a century later, I ask, what does it mean to respond to such an invitation with this gesture of running towards a wall? And this is a photograph, not the best image, but it gives you a sense of the work installed. In my artist statement for House Guests, the catalog, I wrote about the Grange, taking the time to consider the house as the context for my work. And this is what I wrote then. The Grange was the private residence of the Boltons, one of the most prominent families in Toronto's early history. As a site of economic and political power, the the residence had a strong public role, being a place where members of the 19th century ruling class would meet, socialize, and form partnerships. So it's that idea that informed the piece that I decided to make. The fact that this house was not a private home, it actually had a public function for the ruling class of society in the 19th century. I was interested in how the museum's public role today is rooted, and since its inception, in the institution's service of the class system that in the 19th century was called the family compact. I don't know what terms we would use today. This public role of the museum continues today more than a century later, but in a transformed manner. And this is a photograph of the museum, and on the bottom right you have the Grange House. So you literally physically see the architecture kind of grow out of this original, germinating point that the house represents. So I'll continue quoting from the artist statement that I wrote then. I wrote that today's AGO is linked architecturally and ideologically to the house from which it originated. These roots are nourished and perpetuated by the gallery through its donated collection and sponsored programming. Through its collection, the gallery becomes the public repository of the collecting tastes of wealthy individuals. Through its programming, the gallery realizes the publicity requirements of powerful corporations. So my point is that one of the ways in which the AGO fulfills its public role is in furthering the class interests of individuals and corporations alike. That's one of the public functions of the museum. However, I also wrote that there's a different way in which a museum like the AGO may fulfill its public role. And this is what I wrote. As its curators, artists, and audience use the gallery to present their own various points of view, one can consider as the very definition of the AGO or any museum in its role as a site of conflict, where these often competing manners of being public are engaged in struggle with one another. So this site of struggle provides the parameters, the force field, the magnetic, energetic force fields, the walls that my figure in the Grange is running towards. I wrote, "It is bad manners for a guest to run and flee from its host's house. Perhaps the house's walls will prevent the guest's luminous pixelated body from running outside and doing itself harm. For the walls of this house are fleshy. These walls are built by history, they are maintained by history, and they are the walls that history will build upon or overcome. That is the nature of their fleshiness. Our guest will perhaps only bump its head on the wall, emerging without harm to itself and without disgrace to its host. Or it will perhaps traverse this wall, emerging into the park outside and the city beyond, this city where more people are servants than either hosts or guests." With my running figure then, I tried to make a proposal to ask viewers to consider the experience of being up against the wall as a moment of being poised between two possibilities, traversing walls or running into them. So that's the first event that I wanted to talk to you about. The second event happened only 2 years ago in 2023. In 2023, the AGO announced the departure, this is the museum's preferred euphemism, of Wanda Nanabush, the AGO's indigenous curator, after 7 years on the job. This came as a great shock, an earthquake, the seismic effects of which are still being felt across the country. And for months, I've been in conversation with folks here in Victoria who are also deeply impacted by this shock. After all, Wanda had been doing hugely transformative work at the AGO. Her presence in the institution was powerful. She's like a force of nature. If you've met her or talked to her, I think you'll know what I mean. In a short time, she had curated 3 major retrospective exhibitions of indigenous artists within an institution that had, in more than a century, never chosen to do so. For example, in 2017, she presented the exhibition Rita Latondra, Fire and Light, co-curated with Georgiana Uliaric. In 2018, Wanda presented Rebecca Belmore, Facing the Monumental, which toured to the Ramai Modern in Saskatoon and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Montreal. And in 2022, she presented Robert Houle, Red is Beautiful, which toured to Calgary Contemporary, the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and the Smithsonian Museum of American Indian Art. Each of these projects is like an incredible amount of work and really pushes the field in such significant ways. And in a matter of like 7 years, she had done 3, and this is scratching the surface of her work. This is each of these exhibitions was also accompanied by a catalog documenting these artists' careers. So this is all to illustrate what I mean when I described Wanda's presence at the AGO as being a kind of force of nature. Only 1 year after she had been originally hired, the AGO announced that the Department of Canadian Art, for decades a kind of keystone in the museum, was being renamed as the J.S. McLean Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art. This was due to Wanda's tireless advocacy for structural change within the institution. In an important text titled Performing Sovereignty in the Museum, published in 2021 in the Uneven Bodies Reader, Wanda wrote about the decision to restructure the AGO's Department of Canadian Art. And these are her words. Instead of creating a separate Indigenous art department, distinct, that is, from the Department of Canadian Art, we decided to use a nation-to-nation model for a joint department where we shared power. It seems so simple. But the order, the sequence of Indigenous and Canadian was extremely important. They, the AGO, said Canadian and Indigenous. I had to work to get that switched because we're first. We should always be first. It means that the land that we stand on, the sovereignty of that land, is First Nation sovereignty. Canadian sovereignty derives its existence from ours. It is a way of reversing the way that we were traditionally trained and taught to think about sovereignty. I think museums never talk about sovereignty. We try to avoid it, because museums are usually nationalist institutions meant to serve the nation state, that is, a colonial state. This was a way to infiltrate and put the most radical ideas of sovereignty straight on the walls. On October 10th, 2023, Wanda Nanabush, the AGO's curator of Indigenous art, and Georgiana Uliaric, the curator of Canadian art, were awarded the 2023 Toronto Book Award for their catalog, Moving the Museum. The book documents 6 years of projects of this new Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art. The Toronto Book Award jury described the book as revelatory, stating that this publication kicks the colonial gaze to the curb. A month after being honored with this award, the AGO announced the departure of Wanda Nanabush from her job as curator. What had happened? This was a shock and it made no sense. During this time, I was a member of the AGO's Committee for Indigenous and Canadian Art, and all that we were told was whitewashed messaging. I knew something was wrong. My fears were confirmed when, a few days later, an email was leaked to the arts community. The email was written by people who represented themselves as members of something called IMAC. On its website, the Israel Museum and Arts Canada described itself as a not-for-profit organization dedicated to enriching, promoting, and celebrating Israeli arts and culture by raising awareness and financial support for the Israel Museum, the country's largest cultural institution, and grassroots arts organizations that connect people across all strata of society to their Jewish identity. Just incidentally, IMAC is the rebrand of a previous organization called Canadian Friends of the Israel Museum, an organization that had its charitable status revoked by the Canadian Revenue Agency in 2022 for providing funds to donors who are not qualified as charities and due to issues of oversight. So this IMAC is just a rebrand of something that was deemed by the Canadian Revenue Agency to be doing illegal charity work. The leaked email was addressed to AGO Director Stefan Jost, Wanda's boss at the time it was sent, thus threatening her employment and livelihood. And her crime? She dared to talk about settler colonialism during the fall of 2023. This is a text that Wanda posted on her private Instagram, which I think is worth reading out loud today. So I hope you'll permit me to read it out loud. It's important to understand settler colonialism. It is about one group taking land, eliminating indigenous peoples, remaking history from settler culture's point of view. All violent resistance to settler colonialism is met with far worse and more technologically destructive violence that is seen as justified as self-protection. Settler colonialism is also a process of dehumanization, where settler deaths matter more than indigenous deaths. It is a process of disinformation and silencing, where indigenous knowledge, history, and understanding and experiences are erased, marginalized, or recast as a form of violence against settlers. Settler colonialism is about creating utter hopelessness and isolation for the indigenous population, so that the first two things, taking land and eliminating the indigenous population, can be furthered. There is no way out of this situation without liberty for the indigenous population. There is no peace without recognition that the settler is not going anywhere. This notion of two sovereignties coexisting peacefully and equally in one land has to be thought and imagined. Genocide and segregation and dehumanization can't be the only option countries keep choosing. So this is the message that the IMAC people, one of whom incidentally, Sarah Angel, also cited the AGO's Committee for Indigenous and Canadian Art, described as posting inflammatory, inaccurate rants against Israel. Soon after their email to the AGO director, the museum got rid of Wanda Nanabush. The aftershocks that followed, and which continue to resonate and to disturb, are a matter of public record. If you're interested to know more about the kind of larger context of this, there's a great article by Jason McBride in a recent issue of The Walrus magazine. You can find it online, it's easy to find, or you can talk to me afterwards. For now, I want to return to my initial comment about an encounter with obduracy, meeting a dead end, being up against the wall, and having nothing to grab onto. By the way, this book is a history of the Grange House, titled The Privileged Few. This, I suggested, is an experience that is deeply ingrained in colonial space. So I want to return to my words written 24 years ago about the walls of the Grange House, the walls in which my pixelated figure is running up against. When I wrote, "For the walls of this house are fleshy." These walls are built by history, they are maintained by history, and they are the walls that history will build upon or overcome. What I've been thinking about is the ways in which colonial erasure is precisely designed to cause the feeling of being up against the wall with nothing to grab onto. The effect of this, as Wanda described, is to create utter hopelessness and isolation for the indigenous population, so that taking land and eliminating the indigenous population can be furthered. As an artist, I opt for grabbing onto this nothing of erasure, leaving its traces upon the fleshy wall that I'm up against. This photograph shows the wall at the entrance to the AGO Center for Indigenous and Canadian Art. The wall once contained a text in Anishinaabemowin, English, and French that outlined its nation-to-nation mandate. This text was removed following Wanda's departure, an act of erasure that is also a gesture of protest. As an artist, the question I have is, can we ever see erasure? Could we hear silencing? During the past year, I've witnessed and experienced forms of violence in the arts community that I never imagined possible. In November 2023, I took a series of photographs immediately following Wanda's sudden departure. The series is titled Moving the Museum, What Then Remains. One image depicts a finger, my own, pointing to this fleshy wall. Traces, like tiny hieroglyphs really, of its nation-to-nation mandate are still barely discernible. So there was the wall, the vinyl lettering. Someone was asked to remove the vinyl lettering. And so there were tiny, tiny little traces of dust and glue, I guess. And a few days after I made this image, even these slight traces had become completely whitewashed. Other images in this series of works feature museum visitors, groups of friends on an outing, young students on a school visit, teenagers hanging out. To my eyes, they constitute the figure of the innocent passerby. And I'm curious to ask, what aspects of the power struggles playing out inside the museum do passersby glimpse as they meander from exhibit to exhibit? And also, what traces of their own power relations occurring outside the institution are they able to bring to bear within it? These photographs document a moment of backlash. They attempt to make erasure a matter of perception. It is painful to tell the story of backlash at the same time as it is happening. The statement of concern from members of the international indigenous arts community to institutions worldwide that was published on November 28, 2023, attempts to do just that. So when it was announced that Wanda departed, there was a flurry of activity, calls for boycott, letters of concern, tons. The one I'm referring to for today is a statement of concern from members of the international indigenous arts community. In this statement, the authors referred to what they called our capacity for pattern recognition. I love that so much. What does this mean? In their letter, the indigenous authors of this statement contextualized Wanda's departure within a larger pattern, and I'm going to read their words. Wanda's departure follows Lucy Bell, Haida, head of Indigenous Collection and Repatriation Department, who stepped down from the Royal BC Museum and Archives in 2020 due to admitted, quote, acts of racism and discrimination at the museum, with Indigenous team members subjected to acts of discriminatory behavior. Shortly after, Troy Sebastian Kutunaja, curator Indigenous Collection, also left the RBCM at the end of his contract after publicly calling for change. A report written by the RBCM Board of Directors in June 2021 stated, quote, the whole museum must be reimagined and decolonized to ensure that we do better work as we work to earn back the confidence and trust of those who were made to feel unsafe, excluded, isolated, or unwanted. In November 2022, the letter continues, Ghanaian Genaga artist and curator Greg Hill was also dismissed from the National Gallery of Canada with little transparency from the NGC, save for a statement from the interim director and CEO, who said that they, quote, needed to look at how they can do things differently and move away from traditional ways of working that are no longer reflective of the kind of institution we need and want to be. 3 weeks ago, Gallery West quoted the new director of the National Gallery of Canada, Jean-François Bellil, as blatantly stating, quote, I think there's a way to make our societies better, make our galleries better, which is the part where I'm concerned with, is making the gallery better. But what is decolonization? What would it entail? I'm not even sure I'm interested in thinking about it. I'm interested in building something, not debuilding it. So this is the pattern recognition that this letter is crafted to allow us to perceive, not one isolated person, not one isolated institution, but a larger backlash with indigenous figures within the target crosshairs. So I think this letter perfectly illustrates what I mean. What I mean when I speak about a time of backlash. What I mean when I talk about being up against the wall while running into it. Walls around us that are sustained by acts of erasure and non-disclosure agreements. I'll end my presentation with a quote from the author Anne Carson, who writes about history and survival. She writes, "History and elegy are akin. The word history comes from an ancient Greek verb meaning to ask. One who asks about things, about their dimension, their weight, their location, their moods, their names, their holiness, their smell, is a historian. But the asking is not idle. It is when you're asking about something that you realize you yourself have survived it, and so you must carry it, or fashion it into a thing that carries itself." Personally, I'm not so certain that I'm surviving this moment of backlash, even as I attempt to historicize the present moment. But what interests me most about Carson's message is what comes next, after she writes about asking and the one who asks. She writes about muteness, defined here not as silence, but as a kind of onomatopoeia. You know what onomatopoeia is, right? Like it's a word that doesn't have an arbitrary relationship to the thing it refers to, like the word table is arbitrary set of letters that refers to real tables. But an onomatopoeia is a word that the word itself is composed of the sound that the referent itself makes. Note that the word mute is regarded by linguists as an onomatopoeic formation, referring not to silence, but to a certain fundamental opacity of human being, which likes to show the truth by allowing it to be seen hiding. Thank you very much.